December the 7th, 1941 was a turning point in 20th century history. The world was changed forever by the attack on Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, 2 squadrons of Japanese planes had paralyzed United States Pacific Naval Forces in one of the most daring naval and air maneuvers of all time. The shock and anger over the surprise raid united a divided America more than any other event in recent history. Tora, Tora, Tora. The true story of Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December the 7th, 1941, a swarm of fighter planes, each bearing a fiery red sun, soared over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At 7:53 a.m., a Japanese commander radioed his pilots saying, "Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." Within minutes, bombs and torpedoes were falling from the sky. Without any warning, a massive Japanese air fleet crippled the U.S. naval forces of the Pacific with an intricate, well-planned attack.
They passed this word. Jap planes attacking Ford Island, this is no shit. That's word for word. And I realized then, this is no drill, it's a real thing.
そしてやがて待ちに待った打撃隊が
The torpedo bombers released their torpedoes, which splashed into the water. The bombers were like dragonflies skimming over the surface of a pond. When I saw all this, I knew the attack was going to be successful.
I can still remember walking around that gun, cussing everything in the world, kicking and screaming and hollering. I was not the cool, calm, and collected hero. I was madder than hell.
Hundreds of American servicemen tried to fight back, but the attempt was futile. In less than 2 hours, the damage had been done.
I was burned over between 60 and 70% of my body. You were on fire, and you just went through the motions of trying.
2,403 Americans died that day.
Their lives was cut off short. Everything was gone in just a matter of minutes. When you think about that, it gets pretty emotional.
The attack provoked shock and anger across America.
How could the Japanese possibly do this? They did it, because history teaches you that when you're not prepared, it usually happens.
The Pearl Harbor attack became a pivotal moment of the 20th century as it forced the United States into the Second World War. It also stirred racial tension and brought on the atomic age. The memories of the assault still haunt the minds of many, and an era of confidence and resilience was lost on that December day. By 1939, Europe was engulfed in what would become the Second World War. But across the Atlantic, the United States had been enjoying peace and prosperity since the end of the Great War and the Great Depression. Most American citizens were more concerned with matters at home than battles abroad.
The United States in the 1920s and 30s, things were going pretty good. It was a climate of good feeling for the country and let Europe do their own thing.
Foreign disputes.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt won his third term of office by promising to keep the peace.
We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army, naval or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas except in case of attack.
Hitler was trying to conquer Western Europe. In support, Roosevelt sent arms to Great Britain, China, and later Russia through the Lend-Lease Acts. But even this intervention received opposition from the isolationists, who wanted to insulate America from world affairs. The isolationists created the America First movement, which was championed by aviation hero Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic.
When England asks us to enter this war, she is considering her own future. And that of her empire. In making our reply, I believe we should consider the future of the United States and that of the Western Hemisphere.
Americans like Lindbergh were concerned about a war in the Atlantic, but the United States also had problems in the Pacific. Japan had become a force to be reckoned with since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Japan had been an ally of America in the First World War, but by 1931, the island nation wanted to build its own empire. Japan was a unique country. The Japanese were one race of people who spoke one language and practiced a mixture of Shintoism and Buddhism. Everything about them was completely foreign in the eyes of most Americans.
I think racism was no doubt part of the Pacific War. The American perception of the Japanese of being different. They talked differently, they wrote differently, they ate differently. Everything about them was different.
The Americans didn't understand the Japanese. First of all, to them it was like a National Geographic magazine. They were inferior. The country was very racial, very, very racial, and the Japanese were at the lower order of the human evolution. Now the Japanese saw the Americans, ironically, almost in the same light. To the Japanese, the Americans were not pure. Their view was what they saw in the motion pictures. The Americans to them were gangsters and bums and prostitutes.
Cultural and philosophical differences would eventually drive the two countries to war. For centuries, Japan had been governed by emperors. Emperor Hirohito had been on the Japanese imperial throne since 1926. But by the 1930s, the country was primarily ruled by the military rather than the monarchy. All men were drafted. The Japanese believed in the Bushido Code, which meant service to one's country above oneself. Yozo Fushita, a former Japanese fighter pilot, held these ancient values.
I was an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. That means I was a samurai. It meant to act honestly and to act fairly as far as fighting was concerned, to do one's best for victory.
For decades, Europeans had ruled Asian countries under colonial governments. But by the 1930s, the Japanese believed that Asia should be ruled by Asians. They steadfastly built up their army and navy. In 1931, Japanese military forces attacked Manchuria, now part of China. The Japanese believed they were liberating the Chinese from colonialism. They also desperately needed China's natural resources to build up their own empire. As a result, the Japanese army continued their assault. In 1937, they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Chinese men, women, and children in what became known as the Rape of Nanking. America was shocked by the brutality and sent millions in relief funds to China. The incident sent a warning to Washington to fortify its Pacific territories. In April of 1940, the Pacific Fleet was transferred from San Diego to the territory of Hawaii, approximately 2,500 miles west of the U.S. mainland. The Navy's battleships were moored on the island of Oahu at a place called Pearl Harbor, a major naval base in the Pacific. Roosevelt believed having his fleet stationed at Pearl, as it was known by the locals, acted as a deterrent to the Japanese.
This harbor was well equipped to handle the 185 vessels that were here on that fateful day, primarily because there was ample space for them. So when you think of Pearl Harbor, you think of it as a vast network of anchorage opportunities.
The battleships moored at Pearl Harbor were the pride of the Pacific Fleet. One of them, the USS Arizona, was launched in 1914 in New York City. She was christened the Ship of Destiny. After surviving the First World War, the battleship was modernized. The main battery was increased to 30 degrees elevation for improved range. 50 caliber machine guns were mounted on both masts. Like other battleships, the Arizona was seen as a symbol of American naval power. For over 25,000 military personnel stationed at Pearl, the port was paradise on earth. Many sailors spent their tour of duty running through practice maneuvers and alerts, but on leave, they ventured into Honolulu to soak up the tropical sun and Hawaiian hospitality. Richard Fisk, a bugleman on the USS West Virginia, recalls.
There was a lot of activity going on in Honolulu. We had ice cream parlors that we visited, and then there was a few bars, and we could get a cold beer for 25 cents. It was a great place. You could go down to Waikiki Beach, and we could see the bathing beauties and stuff like that, you know, and you could sleep on Waikiki Beach and nobody would even bother you.
Pearl Harbor became a port of romance. Lenore Reichert was a nurse working at the Naval Hospital. While nursing the sick, she met her future husband, Albert Reichert, a sergeant in the Marine Corps.
I met my husband at that time. He had been a patient in the wards there, and we weren't supposed to go with patients, of course. I remember he was stationed at the Marine base right next door to us. So I would go down the road and I would flash my light off and on as I came down the road, so he would step out from the bushes knowing that it was me that was coming. Nobody talked about the possibility of war. That was the farthest thing from our minds.
But in reality, the possibility of war was not that far away. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. Japan was now formally on the side of the enemy. As a result, Roosevelt wanted to reorganize his base in Hawaii. In February of 1941, the president appointed two new commanders. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short was made commanding general of the Hawaiian Department, and Admiral Husband E. Kimmel became Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Kimmel knew that someday the Japanese would be the enemy, but he saw the Japanese as the enemy in terms of a battleship war, that he would be a battleship-type commander and go out and fight the Japanese out in the open sea, and not particularly at a place called Pearl Harbor.
The president believed American involvement in the Second World War would eventually begin in Europe. Kimmel and Short felt that their military budget was inadequate and that their naval base contained inferior equipment. In addition, Kimmel reluctantly obeyed Roosevelt's orders and transferred several key ships from Pearl Harbor to the Atlantic arena. At the time, they had no idea what was heading east across the Pacific. Japan's alliance with Germany and Italy put diplomatic relations with the United States in jeopardy. One military leader felt his country must prepare for the worst as Japanese troops pushed further into Asia. He was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet.
Yamamoto foretold before the war would start, our cities would burn to the ground. If Tokyo is going to be destroyed several times over, I cannot sit still as a military man. I must do my best to prepare.
Yamamoto, while born into poverty, was blessed with a brilliant mind. He excelled at the prestigious Japanese Naval Academy in Etojima and eventually came to America to study at Harvard University. Yamamoto understood the American psyche and believed that one day he might have to fight the very country he admired. Zenji Abe, a former lieutenant in the Japanese Imperial Navy, remembers the admiral.
Admiral Yamamoto was against fighting the Americans. But he felt that war with the United States was inevitable because the Japanese army had been fighting in China for 10 years.
In February of 1941, Yamamoto fine-tuned an idea he had to paralyze the US Pacific Fleet. The plan was given the code name Operation Z. He calculated that by crippling the American battleships and carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan would have at least 6 months to conquer Asia before the American fleet could remobilize. Yamamoto assembled Japan's best and brightest to be part of his inner circle. Commander Minoru Genda became one of the chosen few. Genda was an aviator ace. He had put together a team of pilots called the Genda Circus, who were similar to the American barnstormers of the 1920s. Genda helped Yamamoto plan a massive and intricate air raid. They would first send out 31 vessels, which included 6 carriers transporting over 400 aircraft to within 220 miles north of Oahu. The strike force would then launch 2 separate air attacks using a combination of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and horizontal bombers.
As far as he was concerned, the air arm was the prominent and will be the prominent arm of the upcoming war, should there be one. And he was right.
The pilots engaged in special war games in the months prior to the attack. They trained at Kagoshima Bay in southern Japan, which had a similar layout to Pearl Harbor.
In the 1920s and 30s, the best and brightest in America didn't go into the military. But in Japan, to be in the military was the best that one could do.
The Japanese Army and Navy trained longer and harder than the US military. They also invested time and money in exotic weapons. At the time, most torpedoes needed to run in water at least 60 to 70 feet deep. Pearl Harbor was only 30 to 35 feet deep. But the Japanese had engineered a new wooden fin torpedo with anti-roll stabilizers which could be dropped into these shallow waters. The new torpedo had enough stabilizing force to continue moving towards its target without immediately sinking to the bottom.
The Japanese were brilliant at making torpedoes. The wooden fins are strictly for aerodynamic stability. Upon entering the water, they broke away. And the wooden fins played a very significant role in stabilizing torpedoes, especially in very low and slow type drops. Because without those, it'd hit the water, it may roll and hook off and miss your target.
The attack was top secret. No one beyond Yamamoto's inner circle was supposed to know about the covert mission. But rumors leaked. The first real warning came in January of 1941. Joseph Grew, the United States ambassador to Japan, overheard at a cocktail party that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. But Grew, as well as Army and Navy personnel in Washington, gave the rumor no credence. Back in Hawaii, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were certain Japanese aggression would start at Pearl Harbor. General Short was more concerned with the large Asian population living on the island of Oahu. He worried about espionage activity. Japanese spies could easily mix and gather information. Short's hunch was right. The Japanese had a small yet effective spy ring working in Honolulu. Takeo Yoshikawa was one of Japan's principal spies.
Takeo Yoshikawa was a naval officer who was sent here under the guise of a diplomatic mission, and his job was to go out and look at the resources that were here, in particular the Pacific Fleet. He studied the tendencies of the fleet, when it came and when it left. He rented aircraft as a tourist to fly over the island to look at the airfields and other defenses here.
The United States also had its own way of spying on the Japanese. By 1941, cryptologists had intercepted several coded messages from Tokyo radio broadcasts. The US intelligence operation and the machine to decipher the messages were codenamed Magic.
You're getting messages such as diplomatic traffic. You're looking at what the policies or perhaps the initiatives that country's going to put forth. And in particular, we were reading their diplomatic messages quicker than the Japanese were reading it in their embassy in Washington.
Great Britain had 3 magic decoding machines. Washington had 4. The American bases in the Philippines had 1. Pearl Harbor, on the other hand, didn't have any.
Kimmel and Short only got the messages that the people in Washington wanted them to get or thought that were necessary that they should get.
One important message that Kimmel and Short didn't receive was the bomb plot message. Spies in Honolulu were told to divide Pearl Harbor into 5 areas. These regions contained strategic targets that Japanese pilots would later use in their attack. Most of them focused on the battleship areas. But the messages decoded were of a diplomatic, not military nature. They spoke of general interest in Pearl Harbor, but did not spell out an attack. As a result, most didn't cause alarm. By the summer of 1941, political tension had escalated between the United States and Japan. On July the 24th, Japanese troops occupied French Indochina. In retaliation, the United States placed an iron and oil embargo on Japan. At the time, the US supplied the island country with over 80% of its raw resources. The sanctions put the Japanese in a desperate situation. Emperor Hirohito wanted to negotiate peace with the United States, but his opinions were overridden by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, an army political hardliner and warlord. Tojo felt Japan shouldn't cave in to American demands in China. As a result, Japan sent Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu and Japan's ambassador to the United States, Kichisaburo Nomura, to Washington in the autumn of 1941. They presented a final proposal to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, saying that Japan agreed to make no advances beyond Indochina if the United States restored free trade with Japan. But at the same time, the Japanese government told Yamamoto to prepare for the attack on Pearl Harbor.
They negotiated, but not in very good faith. And this is the thing that bothers most Americans, because while they were negotiating, they were playing dirty. They were planning to attack the Americans.
On November the 26th, while negotiations were still pending with the United States, Yamamoto's combined fleet secretly left for the Hawaiian Islands. 6 carriers, the backbone of the Japanese fleet, were commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a hardened sailor whose speciality was navigating on the rough Pacific waters. The fleet took the treacherous northern route to Oahu, voyaging over the high seas in the dark and under strict radio silence. Yamamoto wanted to ensure that his fleet would not run into any enemy ships en route. On the following day, November the 27th, Secretary of State Hull flatly rejected Japan's proposals. He gave them an ultimatum: leave China or pay the consequences. To the Japanese, Hull's ultimatum was tantamount to a declaration of war. But officials in Washington were not aware of the significance of the failed talks. Back in Japan, the Japanese Privy Council agreed they would give the United States a 30-minute warning before the first bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor.
Admiral Yamamoto, in his briefing, told that a samurai, even when attacking a sleeping enemy, should never attack him while he is in bed. Instead, he should kick off his pillow, wake him up, let him have a sword, and then attack him.
The same day negotiations broke down, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were given a war warning by Secretary of State Hull. Both men thought the conflict would begin somewhere in the Pacific, but they were even more worried about espionage activity on the island. They saw no need to alarm the general military populace. However, General Short ordered all aircraft on the bases to be parked side by side to make it easier to guard all the planes against sabotage. This order would have disastrous consequences. On December the 2nd, the order was sent to the Japanese task force to climb Mount Niitaka, the code to proceed with the attack. But nowhere in the message did it say Hawaii. The date was scheduled for Sunday morning, December the 7th. The spy network in Honolulu had followed the ship movements in and out of Pearl Harbor for several months. They had hoped that all the carriers and battleships would be in the harbor that day. And because it was Sunday, most military personnel would be sleeping in. The announcement of the attack roused excitement among the Japanese pilots. They were shown maps and questioned on the types of American battleships and carriers, as well as their potential locations. Yamamoto was not in favor of suicide or kamikaze missions used later in the war. He felt it was bad for morale, and he didn't want to lose good pilots. But one of his officers, Lieutenant Fusata Ida, instructed his young aviators to take their own lives if their aircraft ran out of fuel or were struck by enemy fire.
Our commander, Lieutenant Ida, said, "Well, if I was in that position, I would find the target on the ground and crash into it." He was very clear about this. And when he said that, everybody said, "Okay, then we would do that too."
On December the 6th, the day before the attack, Tokyo sent their embassy in Washington what was called the 14-part note. The first 13 pages laid out why the Japanese were upset with the failed negotiations over China and the oil embargo. The 14th page, in essence, was a cover letter stating that the Japanese must break off negotiations. This final page would not be sent until December the 7th, with specific instructions not to deliver it to the White House until 30 minutes before the attack. On the evening of December the 6th, President Roosevelt reviewed the first 13 pages with a friend and confidant who said, "This means war."
Now, to a lot of people, maybe perhaps that sends off alarm bells, but I'd invite them to go look at a map of the Pacific and ask yourself where this was going to happen.
Roosevelt immediately sent Emperor Hirohito a letter stating he wanted to solve their disputes over China. But his note was held back in Japan for 10.5 hours, presumably by those who wanted to go to war. Time had run out for any last-minute peace negotiations as the Japanese fleet approached their destination. The task force was disappointed to learn that the United States carriers had been sent out to deliver reinforcement supplies in the Pacific, where Kimmel and Short thought Japanese aggression might occur. However, 8 American battleships were still moored in Pearl Harbor. A mixture of emotions fell upon the Japanese pilots as they waited for dawn.
The night before the attack, we all got together and had a little farewell drink, because we may not all be alive the next day. And I tried to sleep, but I felt that tomorrow will be the day that I would die, and I could not sleep all night. We had a mixed feeling of sorrow, that we might die the next day, but also a feeling of pride, because we would die with honor.
Over 200 miles away at Pearl Harbor, it was a typical Saturday night. Nothing unusual was happening. Some sailors stayed on the ships. Others ventured into Honolulu to enjoy the nightlife. Admiral Kimmel was having dinner at a hotel in Waikiki with top Navy brass and their wives. No one suspected the horror that awaited them.
They had what they call a lot of band concerts going on, different ships. So I was pretty well set for the evening, listening to the different bands, all kinds of good music. We're enjoying ourselves. We're going to live forever, 19 years old. Nothing could kill us.
The night of December the 6th, 1941 would be the last time those stationed at Pearl Harbor slept well for some time. The tragic events of the next morning had far-reaching consequences for all Americans. By 6 a.m., the Japanese task force was in position approximately 220 miles north of Oahu. The first wave of 183 planes would take off from the decks of the 6 carriers. Hundreds of well-trained airmen gathered for last-minute instructions before boarding their aircraft. Torpedo aviator Haru Yoshino remembers the excitement aboard his carrier.
Our morale was very high among the pilots and sailors. There was a shrine on board the carrier Kaga, called the Kaga Shrine. The air crew went to pray at this Kaga Shrine with some holy sake liquor, which was then placed on board each airplane.
At approximately 6:20 a.m., the first airwave took off. The crews left aboard the carriers waved and cheered Banzai, Banzai, a ceremonial chant meaning hooray, hooray. The first wave flew across the dark morning sky with anxious anticipation. The task force had successfully traveled undetected for over 10 days. Then the unexpected happened. several Japanese submarines had been positioned outside Pearl Harbor to prevent any ships from escaping. One midget sub even managed to enter the harbor, but was spotted. At approximately 6:45 a.m. Honolulu time, the destroyer USS Ward dropped depth charges, destroying the sub. The USS Ward radioed Naval Headquarters, but no one seemed too concerned. Warren Verhoff, a radio man third class on the tug USS Kinosanka, witnessed the explosion.
It didn't have any significance to us because the ships that were out there on duty, they would drop depth charges if they picked up anything on their sonar. A submarine being out there in that area didn't tell us we're going to have an air attack in Pearl Harbor.
Concrete warnings about the attack were now surfacing. At approximately 11 a.m. Washington time, Admiral Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, received the deciphered 14th page of the 14-part note over the U.S. intelligence decoding machine. The 14th page implied that war was imminent, but there was still no clue as to where. The message was given to General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. He was told to send another warning message to Kimmel and Short in Hawaii. But due to radio interference, Marshall sent the note as a cable, and therefore it wasn't marked urgent. As a result, the message would not be delivered in time. At around 7 a.m. on the northern tip of Oahu, the Opana radar station picked up a large number of planes approaching the island. Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott relayed the message to Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who was unmoved. Tyler assumed they were the B-17s routinely scheduled in from the mainland to reinforce the Hawaiian bases. At approximately 7:40 a.m., 183 Japanese planes flew over the shores of Oahu. To the east was the rising sun, a potent image for the pilots whose aircraft also bore a red, fiery ball. The sky was thick with enemy planes, but below at Pearl Harbor, it was a typical Sunday morning.
The fleet was in great numbers here that morning. Battleship Row was majestic. 7 great battleships moored right behind me. These were small cities, these ships. Crew of over 1,500. Weekend liberty was given. The fleet was at rest. There was not an air of tension here, but a typical Hawaii weekend.
At around 7:49 a.m., the moment had arrived. Commander Mitsu Fushida, a passionate pilot and warrior, was given the privilege of signaling the start of the attack. Fushida signaled with flares and then radioed to his fleet. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. This code meant the surprise attack was successful. The air fleet had not been detected. At Pearl Harbor, Marine detachments assembled for morning colors. Bands stood on the decks of the ships lining Battleship Row. The musicians were ready to play the Star-Spangled Banner when they noticed a large grouping of planes approaching. Robert West, musician first class aboard the USS Oklahoma, remembers the moment.
I was up on the deck waiting to go raise the flags. I can remember saying to the kid next to me, a friend of mine, that I never knew we had so many planes in here. And he said, neither did I. And they just flew right by, right over the battleships. I remember saying that kid, well, that looks like the real McCoy.
Sunday morning, I was on duty, and a plane came down between our 2 wards, but I could tell by him that he was Oriental too. Had a mustache, and I could see him, his eyes and everything. He waved, I waved back to him, and it was right as he was going through those 2 wards. I knew that something was wrong because they never came over to the hospital. Then I heard the bombing.
The first Japanese air wave initially bombed the air bases at Wheeler, Hickam Field and Ford Island to prevent any chance of aerial opposition. Wheeler was the first installation attacked. Hangars were hit with heavy fire. The aircraft, parked side by side according to General Short's orders, were now like sitting ducks, easy targets for enemy gunfire. At around 7:53 a.m., the torpedo bombers zeroed in on the ships moored on Ford Island. The first vessel struck was the target ship Utah, followed by the Helena and Oglala, both struck by the same torpedo. The next ship hit was the Raleigh. A new group of 29 torpedo planes now approached the most coveted target, Battleship Row. Located along Ford Island, there was the Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, and California. The repair ship Vestal was also moored there. These vessels were easy prey for the Japanese aircraft. Seaman First Class James Bounds was aboard the USS Oklahoma.
I got up and, of course, the Admiral's inspecting us on Monday. Then they passed this word, Jap planes attacking Ford Island. This is no shit. That's word for word. Really, this is the real thing.
Bugleman Richard Fisk and his shipmate got a bird's-eye view of the attack from the port side of the USS West Virginia.
When they dropped their torpedoes, then they would climb like this to clear the superstructure of the battleship. They had no idea that they were Japanese, none whatsoever. Then when the torpedoes hit, it blew Stanley and I across the ship. They were 118 feet wide. We picked ourselves up and looked and we said, what in the heck is going on?
Takeshi Maada was one of the aviators who torpedoed the West Virginia.
入れになった水路がありました。そこからちょうど左へ真横に旋回すると
We saw the water channel and we turned left. And right in front of us was Battleship Row. We aimed at the battleship. Our original order was to hit a California-class battleship. But at the time, we didn't know we hit the West Virginia. The torpedo bombers released their torpedoes, which splashed into the water. The bombers were like dragonflies skimming over the surface of a pond. When I saw all this, I knew the attack was going to be successful.
Max Bauer was a first-class metalsmith aboard the repair ship USS Vestal.
It kept on coming, and the machine guns were hitting everything on the decks that they could see. And then it come right over the top of us, less than 150 feet, I would say. I went down below, and I was down there when this bomb came down back after I was. It tore down the ladder that was beside us, and my helper, by name of Reed, was in the way of the ladder, so the ladder cut him in two, and it splattered several of us with his blood.
At approximately 8 a.m., the battleships were sounding fire and rescue. Burning fuel oil now filled the harbor. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were playing golf that morning when they received the news.
Kimmel was ships blowing up, the great ships dying, and he looked at those and it was sad, and all of a sudden a bullet was fired and hit just above his shoulder, And he looked at the person around him and said, it would have been more merciful if it had killed me.
How different it was after that morning. We grew up from a 19-year-old kid to a 19-year-old man, an old man.
By 8 a.m., the attack on Pearl Harbor had been going on for just over 7 minutes. The death and destruction